I do hope that each one of you are going to be listening very, very hard, very, very carefully to what's going to be taught in the next few minutes. To give you a little brief background, this man was a former chaplain of the LA Rams. He happens to be president of the Mayflower Institute. He is the author of a book entitled The American Covenant, The Untold Story. He's been a producer of various television programs. He's been a speaker and teacher to tens of thousands of people across this land. And in my opinion, is one of, if not the foremost experts in the entire nation today on the very subject of our Christian American heritage. And we're going to have an opportunity to learn in ways that I think few people can communicate in the next few minutes by listening to this man very carefully, because he's got a wealth of information, a wealth of knowledge to share. And let's just ask you to help me welcome onto this stage and Tacoma Dome, to this stage, the Reverend Marshall Foster.
Ain't it great? Oh. If my mother could see me now, would you send one of those down to Westminster, California, please? My mother would love it. Thank you. Oh, it's a thrill to be with you. It really is. We were down in Long Beach last weekend, and we had a great time. And this is even more phenomenal this weekend, just to hear the speakers this afternoon. I hope you all appreciate the fact that you're hearing from some of the greatest free enterprisers in America. Do you appreciate that fact? You know, I was an economics major at the University of California, and I was trying to learn economics because I wanted to be economically successful. You've been there, right, when you were in college, and you go there and you study economics because that's the only thing they had closest to business, and I wanted to go out into business when I graduated. And basically I sat there and listened to a guy that was earning $15,000 a year in a ragged suit tell me how to make money and become a millionaire, and I never learned anything. So I was poor the first part of my life because I'd listened to him. So you all have been listening to some people that will show you how to do it because they've done it. And I think that's fantastic. And I don't expect this afternoon at all to steal their thunder, but what I would like to do is to go back and to study the history of what we call the free enterprise system. We have come here this weekend to celebrate free enterprise, but I would venture to say that most of us in this auditorium have been brainwashed as to what free enterprise is all about. Because in our educational system in America today, and this is true over the past 70 years, and I've spent 7 years studying this subject, so I know a little bit about what I'm talking about. What has happened is that the American people have been told that America was founded by a bunch of deists, adventurers, and religious castaways who just kind of wandered into the wilderness, cut down some trees, took some Indian land, put some black people in slavery, and then just kind of stumbled in to this great period of economic success that we call America. If you believe that crazy story, then you believe that Bill and Peggy Britt were just kind of walking along one day and they stumbled over a 40-carat diamond. And they picked it up and Bill said, let's make a ring out of that. And we put it on Peggy's finger. And they just kind of walked into an auditorium like this and said, hi, why don't you do it too? That's not the way it happened. That's not the way free enterprise happened. That's not the way America was founded. But that's what we're told. Now, you're not told that all the time outright by the news commentator. You're told that every time you watch The Rebels or The Bastard or programs like Roots or various other television docudramas. Do you know that 95% of what the American people know about history, they have learned from watching television docudramas? That's what U.S. News and World Report tells us. So because they believe that's true history. And so the majority of people do not understand free enterprise. What you've heard this afternoon is something new to most of us as Americans, because these people are saying to you that free enterprise is worth giving your life for. That there's something here that is worth a life commitment. It's not just a bunch of robber barons who drive around in Cadillacs and run over poor people. And yet that's what we're told very subtly through television docudramas, through movies, books, and through poor, broke economics professors that sit in our universities as in hiding socialists and teach our children for 4 years, and we pay the way. Isn't that ridiculous? And we wonder why our kids graduate from the university of wherever and come out hating the free enterprise system and everything we stand for. You see, it's because they've been retrained. At the time of our founding in 1776, 87% of the people in this country owned their own business, and 90% of the people owned their own home and their own land. Today, of the graduates of the 1982 college graduating class, 3% of the people graduating wanted to be independent entrepreneurs. 3%. The rest of them, except for 5% of the doctors, dentists, and lawyers, many of them are going to be working for the government soon if the government keeps taking away their liberty. The vast majority, over 90%, want to spend their life either working for a major corporation or working for the federal government. Why? So they can get a functional house, a functional car, a functional wife, and a functional picket fence and sit around and function until they're 65 and then they just stop functioning? Something has happened to the American dream. Our dear president knows this is true. He went over and gave one of the greatest speeches, I believe, that have been given in the 20th century. He gave it before the Parliament in England. And of course, this speech that I'm about ready to read part of is a speech that was deep-sixed by the media. One of the most important addresses of our century, and yet you probably couldn't even get a copy of it. I had to go to the White House to get a copy of this address. I certainly couldn't get it from my local newspaper. But in this message that he gave before the Parliament and the Prime Minister in England last summer, the President of the United States spoke to the people of England about the shame that we in the free world must share for not sharing the message of free enterprise with the poor nations of the world. Allowing the communists, whose own people are starving in despair and totalitarianism, to share the lie of communism with the majority of the people in the world, and we just hide our heads and say, well, yes, we are the ugly Americans, and it's too bad that we're successful. And why are we that way? And the president addresses that, and he says this: the British people know that given strong leadership, time, and a little bit of hope, the forces of good ultimately will rally and triumph over evil. Here among you is the cradle of self-government, the mother of parliaments. Here is the enduring greatness of the British contribution to mankind, the great civilized ideas, individual liberty, representative government, and the rule of law under God. I have often wondered, says the President, about the shyness of some in the West for standing for the great ideals that have done so much to ease the plight of man and the hardship of our imperfect world. This reluctance to use those vast resources at our command reminds me of the elderly lady whose home was bombed in the Blitz. As the rescuers found her, they found a bottle of brandy, which was all that was left of her home. Since she was barely conscious, one of the workers pulled the cork and tried to give her a drink. She came around immediately and snapped, here now, that is for emergencies." The president goes on to say that just like her, we better realize that we are in an emergency, and it's time for us to uncork the true meaning and purpose of free enterprise and share that message with the third world and with the nations of the world, or there will be no liberty for any of us. Now, before you applaud that too much, let's go back to something that I think the president finds very deadly, and that is that most people don't know the great principles that we are to teach to the third world. What is free enterprise, and what is the history of free enterprise? You see, we have not been taught that today. Most of us have been brought up in the modern progressive public slave camp. We call it modern public school. And so we have not been taught the true principles of free enterprise. So let's go back to the root. What I'd like to do is in the next 20 minutes, I'd like to trace the history of free enterprise from the book of Genesis to 1983 in America. Now people think I'm really stupid for trying to do this, and perhaps I am, but I want you to tune your brains in, put your minds up to 78, and I want you to watch my lips because we're going to move fast, okay? And we're going to try to cover a lot of history, but I think this is important. A people that do not know their history are doomed to totalitarianism. Listen to the great men of history, and they will tell you that story over and over again. But let's go back. By the way, when you're going back, the reason you go back is because you want to remember this in your mind. The root always determines the fruit. The ultimate ideas behind something always determine the consequences. The root determines the fruit. Ideas have consequences. There are basic ideas that began at the beginning of time that are working their consequences out in 1983. Unless you know the root, you'll never be able to determine the future for yourself, nor will you be able to rebuild our country. So we need to go back to the root and go back farther than Karl Marx. Let's go back farther than Mao's Little Red Book. Let's even go back farther than Adam Smith. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 1. In Genesis chapter 1, we see the basic battle of free enterprise and socialism unfolding. You see, there are basically only two kinds of economics. Now, some of my economics professors, I'm sure, would roll over in their grave if they heard me say this, because they like to make it nice and complex so none of us can understand it, so they can get their PhDs and get their job and work for a major corporation. But let's simplify it down to what I believe are the two basic principles or philosophies of free enterprise that are revealed right here at the beginning book of the Bible. In Genesis 1, Adam is given his command as to what he's to do with this world. We were created, it says in Genesis 1, 26 to 28, to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and replenish it to the glory of God. Now that's a big job. I wish some of our churches would begin to share that message, that is the big job that we as men and women have in America, and we're not just to sit around and plant some roses in front of the church. We got a big job to do. Now let's go back to the job. What do? We be fruitful. Now that's a good thing. In fact, we need to be more fruitful. It is interesting that we're only having 1.8 babies in America today, and that's not even enough to replenish ourselves practically, while some other nations are having 7 or 8. Well, maybe we ought to get back down to doing a little replenishing. I see some of the ladies in the audience looking at their husbands with a little look like, don't get any ideas. Well, I've had enough of that. But it's a good idea. Be fruitful. We need to be fruitful because the number one disciple in your life are your children. And we need to have lots of those. Be fruitful. Secondly, we got to multiply. Multiply. You ever wonder where the plan came from? Rich and Jay didn't think of that in 1959. The whole concept of multiplication is God's concept. That men are not to add, they are to multiply. I'm not just talking about adding numbers in terms of number of bodies in the world. I'm talking about multiplying everything that He's given to us. Every talent, every ability. Multiplication. Multiplying yourself through people. Obviously, you can't do any multiplication if you don't multiply your activities and your lifestyle through other people. Multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. And to replenish it, make it a better place. Now, you say, well, what happened? Well, there was a fall. Adam decided to go his own way. And when he decided to go his own way and turn his back on God's law and God's word, he ended up in trouble, and so did all the rest of us. And we could see it worked out in the lives of his two children, Cain and Abel. The battle that was to go on. There was a curse that was placed upon man, and that curse was that we were to work by the sweat of our brow from morning until evening. Some of us from 6 till midnight. But we're going to work. There's some work involved in life today because we don't live in a society in which there are just grapes and we kind of walk around and pick them off the tree. The second thing is there's going to be pain in childbirth. Some of you ladies can understand this. All of you can, I'm sure. That it's not exactly a pleasurable thing for the most part to have children. It's a painful experience. That's a part of the curse. But economically, we see the truth of how men are to take dominion over the earth worked out in the lives of two people, Cain and Abel. Abel believed God and had faith in what God had said, and as a result, he developed a system of producing. Abel was able, and he went out and he produced, and he brought the first fruits of his labors to God, and God okayed that, said, that's good. You're giving as unto me, and you are taking dominion over my earth, and I approve that. Cain came and his attitude was wrong. Obviously something was wrong with what he had done, and God did not approve what Cain had done. Well, Cain got very upset, and he became very jealous of his brother. You want to learn the history of free enterprise and the history of socialism, learn one truth, and that is that the foundation of it all is envy and jealousy. Envy for someone else's goods results in socialism. Cain was the first great socialist. He came up with a great idea. Instead of me producing, I will kill my brother and take what he has. That's much easier. Then I don't have to produce it. In those days, they used to call that murder. Today, we call it the graduated income tax. But it wasn't long before men became more sophisticated, because it became very bloody to go around and keep killing people. See, every time you wanted something, you had to kill your brother and take it. Well, that was kind of bloody, and there wouldn't be very many people left. So they came up with some more sophisticated ideas. It was much better to have the government do it for you. How about the government calls itself divinely inspired? How about the divine right of kings? That sounds like a good excuse. The kings, or the more powerful in the tribes or in the countries, came up with a thought that if we could say that God has ordained us to lead you, then we can take 80 or 90 or whatever percent of your income that we want, and we'll take it to ourselves, and you'll live as a peasant all your life, and we'll tell you it's because God said so. And you think that that system didn't work for a while. It ruled the world for 2,500 years, from the time of Samuel the prophet in 1120 BC, when the children of Israel said, give us a king so we can be ruled like all the other nations. And God said, okay, if you want a king, give them a king. But this is what they're going to have. He's going to take their sons and daughters off to war. He's going to take a tenth of their sheep, a tenth of their cows. He's going to take their free enterprise system. If that's what they want, give them a king. And God gave him a king. And from that point on, the nations of the world were dominated from 1120 BC until 1620, when the pilgrims landed in this beloved land, by the divine right of kings. I want you to envision the history of the world, and I want you to see that the economic philosophy of Cain, which is the philosophy of greed, envy, jealousy, and pride, is the philosophy that dominated the world for most of its existence. The vast majority of the people that have ever lived in this world have never been able to sit in a room like this, eat the food you eat, drive the car you drive, and go home wherever they want to go. The vast majority of them have lived in abject poverty, getting up in the morning wondering what they're going to eat that evening. The vast majority. And this was true up into the 16th century. But something happened in the 16th century. Something happened that was very significant for the history of nations, and that was there was the unleashing of a book into the hands of the common man. The unleashing of that book has done more good for humankind than any other event in all of history. And what happened was that this book was translated into the language of the common people, and that book was the Bible. When it was translated and it was put into the hands of the people began to think, and they began to say, wait a minute, the king's not God, God's God. God's sovereign. Wait a minute, the Bible said all men are created equal here, under God, and that one man is not better than another man. He can't tell me what to do with my property. He can't tell me what to do with my children. He can't tell me how to live, because, wait a minute, God is God. And if the king breaks God's law, then the king is responsible to me and to God. I'm not responsible to obey him if he disobeys God. And they began to think these things through. And there was a group of people, in England especially, as the Bible was unleashed in their hands, because it got into the hands of families. Do you know that the Bible was not in the hands of the people for the first 1,600 years of Christianity? You know, the only Bible you could get would be in Latin, and it would be pinned down to a church pew, and it would weigh about 100 pounds. You know, you had to be a weightlifter, and you had to have about 20 years' wages to get one. So not very many people had one, and not very many people could speak Latin. But when it got into the hands of the people, they began to read it. A small group of people in Scrooby, England in 1603 began to read it, and they soon became called the Pilgrims. This small congregation was persecuted out of England because of their desire to be free, spiritually free and economically free and politically free. And all they were doing is meeting in homes and reading this book called the Bible. They got persecuted out of the land, lost all their homes, lost all their property, and they went to Holland for 11 years. And in 11 years, these 200 or 300 Christians met together in Holland, and they longed for freedom for their children. They longed for economic liberty. They lived in Holland where there was a guild system. As Bill was saying earlier, that we were talking about the unions and what they're doing to the airline industry. Well, in those days, they had a real union. It was called a guild, and if you weren't a member of the guild, you couldn't work. And so the men who were pilgrims who came over to Holland, they couldn't work, period, because they were not a member of the guild. And so their children had to work in like slave labor conditions. And William Bradford, their leader, wrote years later that the reason they came to America was because they couldn't see their little boys and girls at the age of 8, 9, 10, and 11 looking like old men and having their backs bowed and their bodies beaten because they'd been working night and day in slave labor conditions because they were the only ones that could get a job. And they said, well, there's got to be a better life. There's got to be a better way. And they were willing to pay a terrible price to go across 3,000 miles of ocean to a place that no one had settled, into the wilderness where there was no civilization, with little hope of success, when their friends the year before that had left, 200 of them, had been eaten by Indians within 2 weeks after arriving. They took the chance and got on that Mayflower in the fall of 1620 and sailed the ocean for 66 days in the fall of 1620, arriving on November 10th of 1620, 500 miles north of their intended destination, to find out they weren't in the northern parts of Virginia with a nice good climate. They were in Cape Cod with a bunch of rocks and trees. And they had to land there and they had to settle there in the middle of winter. During that first winter, 47 of 102 pilgrims died. They buried their dead in a common grave because they were afraid the Indians would attack them at any minute. In March of that year, the Mayflower went back, and the captain, who had been cursing them all along, said, "Get on the ship, you stupid pilgrims. You're like all the rest. You're going to fail. Get on the ship and let's go back. It's your last hope. You'll all be dead in a few months." William Bradford records that not one pilgrim went back. Not even the strangers who had come with them, who weren't even believers. None of them went back. They all stayed. They survived after that first winter. That spring, an Indian walked into their midst named Squanto. It's a providential story of how God kept them in the midst of absolute adversity with no hope of success. An Indian walks in speaking English and says, "How you doing, brothers and sisters? Glad to see you here. I was just waiting for your arrival." An amazing story of how twice he had been kidnapped from his land and taken to Spain and then taken to England and brought back just 6 months before the pilgrim arrived, not knowing why he was there, with his whole tribe wiped out by a plague. There wasn't an Indian tribe within 100 miles of Plymouth, Massachusetts, because there had been a strange plague that had wiped out the hostile Indians that had lived right on the spot the pilgrims landed. But Squanto was there. The one surviving member of that tribe was there to greet them. And he took care of them. He taught them how to plant fish and corn. He set up a 50-year peace treaty with the Indians where the pilgrims bought the Indians' land. It's a beautiful story. I wish we had time to go into that one in detail, but it's just so exciting to see how these men and women survived through the trials that they faced. But in the fall of 1621, and for 2 years, the philosophy of Cain came back in and attacked the Plymouth colony. You remember we talked about socialism going back to Cain? Well, in England at that time, the dominant philosophy of enterprise was socialism. They didn't call it socialism in those days, but that's what it was. It was, I take 6/7 for me and 1/7 for you. So what they did is the adventurers that had put up some of the money for the pilgrims to go across the ocean said, you've got to work 6 days for us, and we'll let you work 1 day for yourself. We don't care if you're starving. Okay? And so they had to work within an economic structure where they had to live communally. They had to take all of their work, and they had to work in common fields, and they had to bring all their laborers into a common storehouse, and they had to take 6/7 of everything that they earned and put it on a ship and send it back to England, even if they weren't eating. Well, this did not set too well with the people that were there. The women didn't like doing the underwear of the other men. The men that were there, the young men didn't like working 5 times as hard as some of the other men who sat around whittling with a knife and not getting anything for it. And so Governor Bradford records that within 2 years, they were dying of starvation and famine. And by the fall of 1622, they were living on 5 kernels of corn a day. Now, I don't know if you've tried to live on 5 kernels of corn. That'd make the Pritikin diet look pretty silly, wouldn't it? 5 kernels of corn is a little bit ridiculous, but they lived on that, and God preserved them through that. But in the spring of 1623, when Governor Bradford became governor of the Plymouth Plantation, he came back to this book, the Bible, and he said, wait a minute, what did we learn in our time in Holland? What did we learn in England? Did we not learn that if a man shall not work, he shall not eat? Did we not learn free enterprise? Did we not learn that every man should own his own? And he divided up the property around Plymouth into plots. And he said a man will work his own land for his own family. And as the result of that, they started a harvest in the spring of 1623 that set up America for the next 250 years. For from the date, from 1623 until this present date, 1983, there has never been a corporate famine in the United States of America. Why? Because they went from communism to free enterprise in the spring of 1623. Let me relate one other story that relates to that one, that's directly related to it, and that is in the summer of 1623, the Pilgrims experienced a terrible drought. I just came out of Southern California where we used to have droughts. Now we've got 4 inches of rain. I think that things are reversed. You've got the nice weather up here, and they've never had so much rain down in Southern California. Something's going on here, but God controls the weather. I had somebody write into my foundation recently because I put out a newsletter and I was concerned that God was judging America and using weather to do it. And I mentioned that in my newsletter, and I got several people writing me back, and they said, well, what do you think? Do you think God controls the weather? And I wrote back to him and I said, well, who do you think controls the weather? Mother Nature? Gosh, they watch too many butter commercials. That's their problem. But in the summer of 1623, there was a terrible drought that broke out all over the Plymouth area and around where the Indians lived. And that drought went on for 3 months, and their corn, which had started so beautifully up in each one of their individual plots of land, began to wither and die. And by August of 1623, it looked like they were going to move into famine and all die again. And here they were. They went to free enterprise. It was looking so great. But there was one thing lacking. They needed a day of humiliation and prayer to thank God for what He had given them. You know, the one thing that can kill free enterprise is proud free enterprise that is self-dependent, not God-dependent. There's a verse in Deuteronomy 8 that says, when you've built houses and homes and become comfortable and happy, will you then forget God and the one who gave you all that you have? The Pilgrims had a day of thanksgiving in the fall of 16. First, they had a day of prayer and humiliation at the end of August of that year, and the Indians were there dancing around on the outside, and they had tried all kinds of their dances for days and days and days, and they were waiting for the Pilgrims to have their day of humiliation, watching to see what would happen. They prayed all day, and about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Governor Bradford reports that gentle showers began to fall, and for the next 3 days, they fell in such gentle and perfect order that it revived the corn instead of the thunder showers that often came that time of year and wiped everything out. And they were revived, and it left the Indians in amazement, and of course it made the Pilgrims very thankful. That is the story, by the way, of the first Thanksgiving. The real first Thanksgiving was held not in 1621 when there was a little harvest festival, but in 1623 when there was this Thanksgiving Day that was set aside to thank God for the ending of the famine and for the setting up of free enterprise in America. It wouldn't hurt us this Thanksgiving, would it, to instead of just watching 9 hours of football and porking out on about 14 turkeys, to slow down a little bit, and before we give the third course, or maybe even the first course, put those 5 kernels of corn on the plate, and maybe tell our kids the story of what our founding fathers went through to give us the free enterprise system that allowed us to buy that turkey and turn on that tube and watch that football game. Thank you. I get a little. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Wait. We got 300 years to go. Let's go. Sit down. And we got 300 more years now. We got to get through. Now, wait, one more thing. The reason I get so worked up about this Thanksgiving thing, that I give addresses all the time in Christian schools. I love to talk to children, especially young children that are like Christian schools. And I gave a Thanksgiving chapel service at my daughter's Christian school a couple years ago. And I'll never forget asking the children, I said, what do you know about Thanksgiving? And several children raised their hands, and the first girl I called on said, we don't call it Thanksgiving. I just came out of the public school. We can't call it Thanksgiving anymore. It's called Fall Break, and it's called Turkey Day. And we can't even talk about the Pilgrims or their religious life or what they did because that's too religious, so we can't even understand what Thanksgiving is. Another little boy raised his hand, about 7 or 8 years old, and he says, the only thing I know about Thanksgiving is my dad sits in front of the tube and watches football all day long, and we all eat too much and burp. That's it. That is what the vast majority of people know about Thanksgiving. Other than they think that the Pilgrims were a bunch of straight-laced, sober, and sad people, didn't like sex and didn't like drinking and didn't like doing nothing. They weren't happy people, and they weren't the people that were the foundation stone of the free enterprise system, our Republican form of government, the character that built this country, which they were. They were all those things. The story of the Pilgrims is the most fantastic story. It ought to be taught from generation to generation. And up till 50 years ago in America, every person in this country knew that story in depth, inside and out, and taught to his children constantly. See what we need to get back to? Is knowing the true story of free enterprise. Now, what were the principles that these Pilgrims lived by? There were certain economic principles that made them economically successful. They didn't stumble into liberty. There were 4 or 5 things they did. Write these things down. If you got a pencil and pen, you'll become economically successful. I guarantee you if you follow these principles. Don't come to me for the guarantee, but I know someone you can go to for it. 1. They believed in the Protestant work ethic. Ever heard of the Puritan work ethic? It's much maligned today. You don't believe in work, do you? Yes, they believed in work. They believed work was godly because it was done to the glory of God, and it wasn't work 9 to 5 sitting there punching a card for somebody. They believed they were working to take dominion over the earth, to replenish it, to do something important for God. So work was important. They were here for that purpose. Secondly, they believed in tithing. They believe in giving back as unto the Lord, and as a result of their tithing, they believe God would bless them. And that's what the Bible says in Malachi 3 and all kinds of places. You give and God will give to you. In fact, do you know what their tithe did? Their tithe took care of all the welfare of America until 1930. Do you want to know why we haven't had anybody starve in America before welfare got started in the 30s and 40s? Because it was the churches and synagogues of America that through their tithing agencies and through the hospitals and through the charities that were set up in America, it was those agencies and those individual charities coming from the hearts of Christian families and godly families throughout this country. They're the ones that took care of all the welfare of this country. And it can happen again. Excuse me. Another one of my pet peeves. We need to tithe again. Third, honesty. These men were honest, and no matter what their dealings were, the Pilgrims paid back 7 times what they owed to the adventurers because they were cheated even on the books by those adventurers who put up the money. They had to pay them back 7 times, and they even sold their own houses 20 years later to pay off the debt to these crooks that had cheated them. Fourth, they were self-sacrificing. They were willing to pay the price for others, no matter what, to help the other guy build his home, to help the other guy in need. Fifth, they believed in controlling government. When they landed on these shores, they set up the Mayflower Compact. The first thing they did, before they even set foot on Plymouth Rock, was they set up the Mayflower Compact. And all the men on that ship signed that compact, which is the first constitutional government that has ever been set up in a country. The beginning of true constitutional government is back at the Mayflower Compact, where they covenanted with God and one another to build a form of government where they would choose representatives to rule over them. And this form of government was to be a limited form of government. Why? Because they realized that if you do not control the government will take away your economic liberty, your spiritual liberty, and all your liberties. So they knew that there had to be limited government because they just come out of 2,500 years of the divine right of kings, which had taken away their liberties. Well, for 150 years then, after the Pilgrims, the dominant economic philosophy of America was the philosophy of Abel. The vast majority of people owned their own businesses. The Industrial Revolution took off when? It took off during the time when the Bible was unleashed. And if you think that's a coincidence, you're about as stupid as the guy who thinks that Bill Britt just found a diamond on the ground. You got to see that there is a correlation here. The correlation is that they obeyed these principles because they had this book and they lived a certain kind of life, and as a result they were blessed. And early America became a very prosperous nation. So that by the time we reached 1776, our founding fathers, many of them were wealthy individuals. They didn't come over here wealthy, but they had become wealthy, most of them in their lifetime. Of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, most of them were independent entrepreneurs, and they were economically independent. That's why they had the time to spend the time writing the Declaration of Independence. But of those 56 signers, they're also the ones that paid the price. 5 of them lost their lives in the war. 12 of them had their homes ransacked or destroyed. Most of them lost their fortunes in the war. A lot of them lost their lives, but not one of them lost his sacred honor. They paid the price, but they had the free enterprise to keep. In fact, they fought the American Revolution over a 3% tax on tea. Isn't it funny? We're sitting here with a 50% tax rate and inflation rate. You put it all together, it's about 50%, and the American people are barely whining. And the Roman Empire fell apart with a 20% tax burden. You wonder what makes us so quiet. You wonder why it is that we're like a frog being boiled in a pan of water slowly, and we haven't got the sense to jump out. You wonder if we've been brainwashed and if we haven't been educated in the true story of free enterprise. Briefly, let me go back and relate to you why I believe the American people today don't know this story of free enterprise that unleashed the greatest economic machine the world has ever known and founded the greatest nation the world has ever known. Why is it that we don't know that story? Well, we can trace it back to good old Cain again. Now, remember, the philosophy of Cain, or the economic philosophy of Cain, didn't go away. It was still alive and well, very, very well, in Europe in the 18th century at the same time that America was being founded. In fact, the French Revolution took place at the same time as the American Revolution. Many of you know that, right? In 1789. And in the French Revolution, the theory of Cain took on a new sophistication. Instead of just having the government take the people's money away, the people, were reading the Bible, they were getting a little too sophisticated for that, and they were saying, wait a minute, you can't take my money away. They had to come up with some more sophisticated theories. And so the philosopher Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, came up with a good idea. He said that, and let's don't call it totalitarianism, let's call it the general will, or the social contract, or democracy. Let's get the people who are poor, or the people who think they're poor, or the people that we can fool into being jealous, let's get them to vote the taking away of the money of the rich. And then it will look like it's a righteous cause. Doesn't that make sense? And so we'll have a revolution based on that. And the basis of the French Revolution, trace it back, the basis of the French Revolution was rebellion against authority and the stealing of other men's property. In the first year of the French Revolution, not the American, the French Revolution, 50,000 clergy lost their lives and their churches burned to the ground. The wealthy, of course, in France were killed, and then a year or two later, the middle class were wiped out, and a year or two later, it was open season on anybody who the guillotine could get. And pretty soon, the leaders themselves got it. It became such a debauched system that by 1781, they brought in a man named Mr. Guillotine. Maybe you've heard this story, but Mr. Guillotine was his name, and he was brought in before the democracy, the General Council, and he came in with his new invention. Kind of, this must be the Horatio Alger story of France. And he says, I've got this great invention. And to quote him, he says before the council, he says, this invention is so great, we must make haste to get it to the French people. For the French people will feel nothing but the slight coolness on the back of their necks as their head rolls down off of my invention. And the people that were actually in control of the government made that government policy to kill the French people with that machine. That's how far they had come. But you say that's debauched. Well, Karl Marx picked up that same philosophy about 50 years later and put it into his Das Kapital and his other many writings that he wrote in London. And that philosophy was picked up by many Americans and American educators at the beginning of the 20th century. The same philosophy, except rewritten in a Robin Hood manner so that it looks like we take from the rich, we give to the poor, all will be happy. There'll be this class conflict between the bourgeois and the proletariat, and then through this conflict will come the perfect socialist state, just like they have in Poland today. Isn't it wonderful? Boy, their economic prosperity, and oh, isn't it wonderful over there? No, obviously it's sad. It's sad and it's terrible. But that's what's been sold, not only to the people behind the Iron Curtain, it's been sold to the people of America. Do you know why it's difficult to go into the living rooms of our nation and to talk about free enterprise and to get somebody to put his beer down and turn his TV off and suck up his gut and do something for his family and for his nation? Why it's difficult is because that poor man has been brainwashed since he was a young person by the television screen, and so they begin to think there's only two alternatives, not a third alternative in the middle that says we will be responsible and have liberty under law, but you've either got to have liberty, do your own thing, put the porno bookstore across from the school, hey, no big deal, or you got to have a bigoted Puritan society that tells people how to dress and what to wear and what to do. That's the only alternative that's presented on television, and that's done specifically to fool the American people, to get them to think that this is the only thing that they can go for is an anarchistic, revolutionary, do-your-own-thing mentality. I was involved with a Christian organization in the 1960s during the riots, and we were faced with this Marxist philosophy, and I know one of the leaders of that group was Herbert Marcuse, who was a teacher at the San Diego State at that time. And Herbert made a very wise statement. He was 82 years old then. He said, I will cause the destruction of America, and I will bring the communist flag over this country, not through hydrogen bombs, but by bringing beds of sin, destruction, and drugs and music into the young people's homes. And they will be lying on their beds of sin as we come in and put them in chains. That's exactly what they've done to us. Slowly, especially through the education system, they have taken and they have warped our brains and they have warped our minds. So the people that are sitting in those living rooms don't even know how it happened to them, and they're almost angry that you would come and share such a message because they believe that it's a Pollyanna dream, or they believe that you're a robber baron. How could you drive a Cadillac? I mean, the poor in India are starving because you're driving that Cadillac. That's what they've been taught. And you know who's teaching that kind of stuff? Christian colleges are teaching that kind of thing. That's called Christian socialism, and it's nothing more than the philosophy of Cain whitewashed with a little bit of Christianity. Don't believe it. That's liberation theology. You know what's happening in South America right now? Do you know why those nations are going under to Marxism? Because the philosophy of liberation theology, which is nothing more than what I've just been saying, you know, rob from the rich and give to the poor, that philosophy has taken over in South America, and they've whitewashed it and called it Christianity, and that's moving right up the coast of Latin America, and it's moving right up to America right now. And it's entered the college campuses of America. It has inundated the majority of the seminaries in this country, and the majority of the pulpits of this country teach that kind of socialism. When you go into the homes of America, the people are taught before you come in that the government brings prosperity. And the government will make all things right. How many of us sit in front of our tube waiting to find out whether the government is going to raise interest rates or lower interest rates? As though fiscal policy was going to determine whether or not you're going to be economically free. That's commonly called copping out. Secondly, people are taught that it's okay to take away half of your income to feed the poor because that's the only alternative we have in a complex society. Is there not a better way to feed the poor? Is there not a better concept? Well, God sure had a better way. The early Americans sure had a better way, and they seem to be pretty good at it. I don't think anything new happened after 1930. Third, we're taught that free enterprise is selfish. We don't want to be self-centered or selfish, and so we'll just be poor. That's the alternative that's presented to the average person. You see, they've been given a smoke screen of defeat. And before a person can truly be economically free and be able to teach and share that with others, he's got to take away those smoke screens. He's got to be educated. He's got to know the truth, and then the truth shall set him free. Do you know that if you go out of this auditorium and seriously study and think and reason these things through and begin to live out these principles, You are the hope of America because you can re-educate an entire generation, and that can be done in this decade. We don't have to wait 150 years. We can do it because we've got the resources, we've got the ability right here. It's been given to us. And we've got the truth if we will simply study it for ourselves. In fact, I would encourage you not to believe all that I say. Don't believe anything I said unless you can find original documentation to back it up. Check it out. Become self-governing enough to know your heritage, to know your roots. Because the people are so hungry. They want to know the truth. They want America to turn back. Didn't you sense that this afternoon as Bill was talking? Didn't we all sense that the America that we once had is the America we're losing? And yet we want to pay the price. We want to do something to turn it around. Let me leave you with two things that I believe you need to think about doing. And think about them seriously. One, I want to challenge you to learn your heritage. Learn the true heritage of your governmental system, your Constitution, where it came from, what it is that we are a republic. Like Bill said, we are not a democracy. We're a nation built upon laws, not a nation built upon whim. And secondly, you need to know the heritage of what God did in the founding of this country, because it'll give you great hope to realize that you don't stand alone. You see, the real problem with America is not the communist, the socialist, the homosexual, or the moral pervert that's on the street corner peddling his filth. Those aren't the problems with America. Those are like cockroaches that come out when the light's not been shining. Have you ever been in a home? Ever been to Hawaii? And my wife went to, and you go visit a nice home, the lights are out, and these cockroaches 3 inches long are hanging out right under your feet. You don't even know it, right? You turn the light on and these cockroaches take off for the corners. Well, you see, the cockroaches of the death and despair of socialism, the followers of Cain, don't have any guts. And they don't have any staying power. And fortunately for us, they go broke. They use up their money. They don't save it for their children. They don't have any concept of saving, and their own lives fall apart. So our real problem is not Russia. Our real problem are not the moral reprobates. Our real problem is us. We are the only problem we face in America. Because it's the good people in America. It's those who had the heritage. It's those who still have families, who've been busy about the job of just raising our families and trying to earn a living, that have forgotten what has been done for us. The scripture says something very interesting when it says, when there needs to be a reformation or a repentance, it says, remember from whence you have fallen, and repent and do the deeds you did at first. How can we do the deeds in America that we once did? How can we restore the republic? How can we restore the free enterprise system unless we first remember the deeds we did at first? Unless we remember from whence we have fallen, then we will repent. I sense that when people understand the great things that have been done for them, the great price that their founding fathers paid to give them their liberty, and when they begin to teach those things to their children once again are given heroes that are true heroes, that live out their principles. The men become men, and they begin to realize they've got something to live for. There's only one thing I believe that'll keep you from being on this stage, and that is if you don't have a big enough dream. And you know what's going to keep you from having a big enough dream? If you only dream about dollars and cents. If all you dream about is a new Cadillac, well listen, you'll get the new Cadillac and you'll max out at about 50 grand a year. Who cares, right? But if your vision is great and greater than that, that's a good goal, that's fine. 50 grand a year, stair step your goals. But look beyond that. The people that are on this stage, the diamonds that I know in this business, are up here because they're cause-oriented. Because they see a greater goal and a greater glory. They see that what they are doing can change the course of history and help millions of people. That's the first thing. And by the way, you need to get a hold of the materials that we can share with you about our heritage. As you do, a book we wrote called The American Covenant, The Untold Story, you'll find these truths for yourself, and then you can trace it right back to the original documents for yourself and make up your own mind about these things. But I challenge you to do that because it's important for you, it's important for your family. But a second thing you need to do is build this business. Build it, and build it. Why? Why do I say that? Because I'm here and I'm speaking for Bill? No. I'm saying that because it is those who build entrepreneurial businesses like Amway, and I really believe it is the best opportunity for you to become economically independent and become a part of the army of millionaires that are going to move out and save this country. If we had 500,000 millionaires right now who shared a common philosophy and lived godly lives, we could turn this country around. We could do it in 5 years. You know, the truth is that America was built by men of wealth. That is true. It was also destroyed by men of wealth. Men of wealth who put their money in foundations and then paid for the socialization of American education. Men who paid for the destruction of our country through their own foundation grants from large corporations. But it was built by a bunch of free enterprising, independent men and women who paid the price. Let me just, in closing, give you a couple of illustrations. General Thomas Nelson was the governor of Virginia in 1776. When the Founding Fathers went to war, Governor Nelson had more property in the state of Virginia than any other single man. He was the #1 landholder. He mortgaged that property, and he personally funded the Virginia militia, which was the strongest fighting force during the American Revolution. And as a result of his efforts, of course, saved Virginia. At the end of the war, he never got his property back. It was mortgaged and sold because the government couldn't afford to pay him off. But you know, Governor Nelson became the head of artillery for the American forces that were at Yorktown, Virginia in 1781, in the last battle of the war. And Thomas Nelson, General Nelson then, had his large estate home in Yorktown, right inside the city where Cornwallis, the British general, was holding up. And in fact, Cornwallis was holding up in his house. The French leader of artillery then was Lafayette, the great French general who had come over from France to help us. And Lafayette came over to General Nelson. He said, "General Nelson, you know this area better than anywhere. Where should we aim our cannon?" And General Nelson said, "You see that house over there, the large white one? Aim your cannon at that home and destroy it. I don't want one brick of my home to survive if the enemy of my country rests within it." He was willing to give up his home, his wealth, to save his liberty. Robert Morris. Many of us think that General Washington was funded during the American Revolution by the Congress. The Congress did very little to fund the American Revolution. They were the free enterprising entrepreneurs who had to come to the aid of General Washington all the time. And the top of that list was a man named Robert Morris, who was a wealthy ship merchant from Pennsylvania, who put his 70 ships to the service of the American Republic at the beginning of the war. Most of those ships were either destroyed or kept in public service after the war. Mr. Morris then personally funded the first great American victory at Trenton because General Washington came to him and said, "Robert, I need $10,000. With money I can do everything. Without money I can do nothing." And Morris at that point himself did not have it, but he had such a good credit rating. He went over to a good Quaker friend. The Quaker friend said, "What do you need?" And Robert said, "I need $10,000 right now." And he was given $10,000 on the spot. He said, "Because of your character and because of the way you handle money, here's $10,000. He gave it to General Washington. He went over and won the Battle of Trenton. 2 years later, same thing happened. They were going to win the war. We were ready to win the war, but our troops were leaving us because for 2 years, many of them hadn't been paid, and Congress wouldn't give any money to General Washington. Washington went back to Morris again, and he said, "We can go down and defeat the British, but we don't have any money to pay our troops, and our troops are going home." And Morris went and raised $200,000 all from people all over the world based on his own personal credit and gave it to Washington, paid the troops, who then went down and won the final battle of the American Revolution. General George Washington at the time of his death, was one of the most wealthy landholders in America. He had thousands of acres in Virginia. He had one of the most beautiful plantations. I'm sure many of you have seen it, Mount Vernon, just outside of Washington, D.C. But do you know that this gentleman farmer, this man who had spent his life desiring to be on the farm, spent 45 years of his life, until 2 years before he died, serving his country and away from his blessed Mount Vernon? Why? Because he loved his nation. Because he was willing to pay the price. But he had become a man of wealth, and he was a man who could use that wealth because he had the character to put it all together. We want to challenge you this weekend to be men and women of character, because we know so well that the only hope of this country is not in the government. It does not rest in one leader or two leaders. It rests in the character of the American people. It rests in us at the grassroots level, who are willing to pay the price, both to build our own fortunes, to build our own families, and to rebuild this country. Working together, can we do it? Let's go do it then. Thank you very much.